My son-in-law grabbed my wrist hard enough to remind me who he thought was in charge. A sharp pain shot from my joint to my shoulder. I didn't cry out. I just looked into Derek's eyes. They were filled with the greed and arrogance of a man who thought he had stolen a treasure without breaking a sweat. He leaned close and whispered that my time was over. He said this house needed a younger man with vision, not an old carpenter who smelled like sawdust. I looked down at my hands. The thick calluses from 40 years of holding a chisel stood out under the kitchen light. Wood never lies. If you force a piece before it's ready, it cracks. Derek was trying to force me. He thought muscles and forged ownership papers could break me as easily as rotten timber. He was wrong. A good carpenter knows the strongest joints are never made with violence. They're made with precision and patience. Behind him, Cassandra was opening a bottle of mimosa. The soft pop of the cork sounded like a gunshot, sending off the last memories I had in this house. My daughter wouldn't even look at her father. She was too busy admiring the new diamond ring on her finger. She smiled and said, "This house is ours now, baby." She called it a fresh start. But all I could smell in that once clean kitchen was burnt sugar, not food. Betrayal. I quietly pulled my hand away. I started packing the last of my belongings into the oak box I had built with my own hands. I ran my fingers across the smooth wood. Every scratch on that floor had a story. Derek and Cassandra were trampling those stories with their dirty shoes. They wanted me gone so they could fill the house with fancy parties and mountains of mortgage debt. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, some snacks, sit back, and remember this: the people in these stories always had a chance to do the right thing. They just chose wrong. And before we continue, comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. I walked toward the door. A cold wind rushed in. I didn't turn back for one last look at Cassandra. I just tightened my grip on my bag. Inside my head, a new blueprint was taking shape, not for a cabinet or a dining table, for revenge. I was going to show Derek that when you deliberately damage a load-bearing structure, you better be ready for the entire building to collapse on top of you. I had spent my whole life building things, and now I was going to learn how to tear a con artist apart, piece by piece, joint by joint, until nothing was left but the naked truth. The game had only just begun, and this house still held secrets Derek had never heard about. I was the only man holding the key. The story began that afternoon when I returned to my house after a long day at the woodshop. But the place no longer welcomed me with the familiar scent of pine oil. Instead, the air was polluted with a sour mixture of cheap wine and piles of greasy fast food. I stood frozen in the doorway, feeling as though I had stepped into an abandoned construction site. Derek lounged arrogantly in my leather armchair. That chair was the most private thing I owned, the place where I spent my evenings studying complicated blueprints in peace. His muddy boots rested on the wooden ottoman I had spent 3 full weeks polishing by hand. He never even looked up. He just stared at his phone and laughed loudly like the house belonged to him. Then my eyes drifted toward the coffee table in the center of the room, and my chest tightened instantly. My 30-year-old walnut cutting board was lying there. It was the last thing my late wife had ever given me. Now it was stained with dark red wine that looked almost like blood. Derek had used it to slice cheap blocks of cheese, leaving deep knife scars carved into the precious grain. Walnut is a strong wood, but even the strongest timber will eventually be destroyed in the hands of someone who does not respect it. My fingers curled tightly around the small chisel in my jacket pocket. Every structure begins collapsing at its weakest joints. This mess was not simple carelessness. It was disrespect. It was a message Derek wanted me to understand. In his eyes, I no longer mattered inside this house. Cassandra stepped out of the bathroom wearing the expensive scarf she had bought using my pension money the month before. She glanced at the mess, and then looked at me with complete indifference. "Dad, stop making that face," she muttered. "Derek's just trying to make the house feel more alive." I said nothing. I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, when a broken wood fragment on the floor caught my attention. It had snapped off from the leg of the dish cabinet. Derek must have dragged it across the floor while rearranging furniture his own way. He understood nothing about balance or weight distribution. All he knew was how to destroy things. The house itself seemed to groan under his hands. The walls almost felt ashamed. My eyes wandered to the ceiling where faint cracks stretched across the plaster cracks I had monitored for years. A house is just like a person. Once the core begins to rot, no amount of beautiful paint can save it. I started wondering how much longer I could endure this before the joints inside my own heart finally snapped apart too. Then I suddenly stopped. At the far end of the hallway, Derek stood partially hidden in the shadows. In his hands was a familiar blue folder. My insurance documents. My land ownership records. He was secretly photographing every single page. The grin on his face was no longer arrogant satisfaction. It was the grin of a vulture circling a body that had not gone cold yet. Whatever he was planning reached far beyond taking over this house. He was targeting everything I had spent my entire life building. I stayed hidden in the darkness and watched carefully. A skilled carpenter never strikes while the wood is still warped. I needed patience. I needed to know exactly where my prey intended to sink his blade. But the way he stared at those documents revealed a terrifying truth. Derek did not simply want to force me out. He wanted to erase my existence from this land completely. Then he lifted his phone and quietly called someone. "The fish took the bait," he whispered. "We just need one more signature. One more signature." Whose signature? And why did he need it so badly? That was the moment a horrifying realization flashed through my mind. I froze in the darkness of the hallway. My ears rang. The moment I heard the word equity come out of Derek's mouth. He was talking about my house like it was nothing more than collateral. He chuckled when he mentioned my name. Then he told whoever was on the other end of the call, "The old man doesn't know a thing. Ownership is just numbers on paper." My chest tightened instantly. The feeling was exactly like hitting a rusted nail hidden deep inside a wooden beam while running a hand plane across it. One hidden defect can chip the blade, ruin an entire masterpiece. Derek was that rusted nail, quietly tearing into the financial foundation I had spent 40 years building. Then he mentioned a mortgage loan. The number he spoke nearly stopped my heart. He planned to borrow a massive amount of money using my name. He wanted to drain every last drop of value out of this house and leave it collapsing behind him. Shock rushed through me like ice water. But I forced myself to stay calm. A veteran carpenter never panics when he finds rot inside a beam. He first measures how far the damage has spread. I waited until Derek's footsteps faded toward the bedroom. Then I slipped into my small office. The room that once held my blueprints was now littered with empty beer cans. I turned on the computer. The cold blue glow lit up my trembling hands. Inbox. Empty. Trash folder. That was where I found them. Dozens of deleted financial emails. Notifications about account changes. Loan verification requests. Confirmation links. Derek had been quietly blocking every warning before it ever reached me. He was building a perfect trap around my life. I opened the recent transactions. Numbers never lie. And those numbers painted the blueprint of a carefully engineered scam. Derek had started this process the very first day he entered my home as my son-in-law. Every dinner we shared, every handshake he gave me, every fake smile across my table. All part of the plan, a slow extraction of everything I owned. Rage began burning deep inside my chest. But I knew better than to confront him too early. A damaged joint must be replaced carefully. If you tear it out too fast, the entire structure collapses on top of you before you can escape. Then I heard movement behind me. Cassandra. She was standing in the doorway, watching me with suspicion in her eyes. "What are you doing on Derek's computer?" she asked coldly. I quickly shut off the screen. "I was just checking the work schedule for the shop," I said calmly. She didn't believe me. She looked at me like I was the intruder, like I was the stranger trespassing inside her territory. That was the moment I realized the rot didn't end with Derek. It had spread into my own bloodline. Cassandra wasn't just a victim anymore. Whether she knew it or not, she had become part of the rotten framework holding this nightmare together. And I needed proof. Proof so solid no one could deny it. Derek's call about the equity loan kept echoing in my head like a fire alarm I couldn't silence. I knew I couldn't stay in that house another minute if I wanted to keep my sanity. I needed space to think. I needed a new blueprint for this legal war. Tomorrow, I would go to the public library. I would study Derek's financial records the same way I studied flawed construction plans. I would find the weakest load-bearing point in his entire scheme. And then I would break it. Because the truth about Derek was about to surface. And I had the terrifying feeling it was worse than anything I had imagined. I sat in the darkest corner of the public library for 3 straight hours, Spread out before me were not the familiar grains of oak or walnut, but stacks of financial records, buried under endless numbers. I studied them the same way I would study a fatally flawed blueprint. Every line, every detail, every tiny record about companies that had quietly disappeared. My eyes burned under the fluorescent lights. But the truth was finally beginning to show itself. Derek wasn't the successful businessman he pretended to be. He was rotten lumber covered in expensive paint. I found his name attached to a company that had gone bankrupt 2 years ago. The business had been shut down for fraud. Then I found the debt records. $68,000. Enough to crush most men. But the file from 6 years earlier was what truly made my blood run cold. Derek had a history of financial fraud in another state. This wasn't his first time. He was a professional predator who hunted trusting victims and hollowed them out from the inside. He looked at elderly people's homes the same way termites look at a load-bearing beam. I couldn't stop wondering how much Cassandra knew about the man she married. Or maybe my daughter was just another coat of paint Derek used to hide the rot beneath him. The deeper I dug, the more terrified I became. He wasn't just targeting my house. He was targeting my family's future, my name, my honor. Using my identity, Derek had already opened multiple small credit loans before moving toward his final goal, mortgaging the entire house. Disgust rose in my throat. A real carpenter protects the integrity of a structure. Derek did the opposite. He cut away the most important parts and sold them off piece by piece. He didn't care if the entire house collapsed on top of his father-in-law tomorrow morning. I slammed the folder shut. The sharp crack echoed across the library, making several people turn their heads. And in that moment the blueprint for destroying Derek finally became clear in my mind. I couldn't fight him with force. Not like the way he twisted my wrist. I had to use the law. I had to use the same weaknesses he created to trap him inside his own scheme. Then my heart started racing again. At the very last page I found one more detail. Derek was preparing to sign a land transfer agreement this weekend. If I didn't act immediately, I would lose the home I had belonged to for 40 years. The patience of an old carpenter had reached its limit. I needed an ally. I needed somewhere safe to hide before delivering the final blow. I rose slowly from my chair and gathered my things. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag like I was gripping a razor-sharp chisel. This con artist thought he had built the perfect structure. But he had forgotten one basic truth every builder learns eventually. A structure built on lies always has a weak point, and I had finally found his. I stood outside my house one last time, but I didn't enter through the front door. Instead, I quietly slipped around back through the woodshop entrance. I started gathering the most valuable things I owned. Not gold, not cash. My father's chisels and hand planes. I held them, carefully wrapping, each one in soft felt cloth. The cold steel against my palms steadied me. These tools were the soul of this house. I was removing the core and leaving behind nothing but an empty shell for the greedy parasites upstairs. I packed everything with deliberate precision, every drawer closed softly, every tool set down without a sound. I felt like a craftsman dismantling a rare wooden framework before termites could devour it. Upstairs, Cassandra and Derek were still awake. I could hear loud music, and Derek's victorious laughter echoing through the ceiling. He thought he had broken me. He thought my silence meant surrender. He didn't understand something every carpenter knows. The quietest wood often holds the most pressure, deep inside before it finally bends. Ray, my old friend, was waiting at the end of the street. His house would become the workshop, where I drew the blueprint for my counterattack. As I carried the last wooden box out the door, I looked up and saw Derek standing on the balcony. A glass of wine hung lazily from his hand as he smirked down at me. He didn't say a word. He just motioned like he was shoving a beggar off his property. Rage flashed through me like fire, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Anger splits the grain. I needed the cold discipline of steel. I took one last look at the house. The charcoal-colored walls I had painted with my own hands now felt like a stranger's home. But this wasn't defeat. It was strategic retreat. I was stepping back to build something stronger. Inside my jacket were the financial records exposing Derek's crimes. Those documents were nails waiting to seal shut the coffin of his entire future. Then Cassandra appeared at the upstairs window. She watched Ray's truck pull away, but never called my name. She had chosen her side. The pain in my chest felt like a dull saw dragging across bone. But rotten wood must be cut away if you want to save what remains of the structure. Before we watch Harlan begin hunting down Derek's other victims, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss this legendary turning point. Ray's truck rolled slowly into the night. I watched my house fade away in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the fog. Derek thought he had won because he claimed the body of the house. But a carpenter never abandons his creation. He simply searches for the missing pieces. And that was exactly what I was about to do. I was going to find every person Derek had stepped on, every victim he left buried in silence. Together we would create a pressure no fake structure of lies could ever survive. That night I slept at Ray's house. But in my dreams I was holding a sledgehammer. And the target was the crumbling foundation Derek was standing on. The hunt for the hidden victims had officially begun. And Derek was about to learn something important. Justice is a structure built slowly, but once finished, it is almost impossible to tear down. I drove through the empty suburban streets with a list of forgotten names resting on the passenger seat beside me. Victims Derek had drained dry before throwing away like scrap wood. The first person I visited was Thomas Whitfield. He lived in a cramped rental apartment that smelled like dust and old cigarettes. The moment I mentioned Derek's name, the light in his eyes vanished completely. Thomas had lost $41,000. Every penny he had saved to open his own auto repair shop. He told me Derek promised him an investment in a real estate project that never even existed. But the rage inside me truly ignited when I met Ruth Ann Pellier, 73 years old, living alone in a tiny house behind a rotten wooden fence. Derek had stolen $12,000 from her by pretending to be an insurance representative. That money was supposed to pay for her medication and retirement expenses. As I watched her trembling hands clutch a cold cup of tea, something dark shifted inside me. Derek wasn't just a fraud. He was a predator feeding on weakness. I sat in my truck afterwards, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. A strong structure should never allow weak points like this to exist. Justice is a framework you must build, carefully, piece by piece. I told Thomas and Ruth that I was gathering the broken pieces together. I needed them to testify. At first, fear filled their faces. They thought Derek was too clever, too slippery, too experienced to ever get caught. Then I showed them the financial records, the loan requests, the fraud reports, the fake companies. I showed them the weak joints in Derek's entire structure beginning to crack open, and slowly something changed between us. We were different pieces of wood scarred by the same blade. Together we could bear weight again. Derek thought these victims would stay buried in darkness forever. He never understood one simple truth every carpenter learns eventually. Once light reaches rotten wood, the decay becomes impossible to hide. I spent the entire night recording their statements. Every tiny detail, every date, every promise Derek made before destroying their lives. I assembled their stories like building the framework of a house. Each testimony became another nail, locking Derek's crimes into place. And strangely, I didn't feel exhausted. I felt stronger than I had in years. Derek thought I was alone, but his own cruelty had accidentally built an army against him. Before we reach the tense confrontation between Harlan and his daughter, make sure you subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you believe karma eventually comes for everyone? By the time I returned to Ray's house, dawn was beginning to break across the horizon. The invisible blueprint was finally spread across my desk, in plain sight. These victims were no longer just names on paper. They had become the load-bearing supports of the justice I was preparing to deliver. Meanwhile, Derek was still sleeping peacefully inside my house. He had no idea the people he once mocked were quietly closing in around him. Soon I would show him the true strength of truth, when every piece is joined together correctly. But before that could happen, there was one more critical support beam I needed to face. Cassandra. I had to show my daughter the monster she was sharing a bed with every night. And I knew the conversation waiting ahead would hurt more than anything Derek had ever done to me. Cassandra came to Ray's house on a gray, heavy afternoon. My daughter looked exhausted. The arrogant mask she had worn just days earlier was finally beginning to crack. She never came inside. She stood on the porch and asked me to withdraw the eviction notice. She said I was embarrassing her in front of the neighbors. She said Derek was going through a difficult time. She called me a cruel father. I looked at my daughter and saw a wooden beam bent so far it was about to snap. I wasn't angry, only heartbroken. I invited her to sit down on one of Ray's rough wooden chairs. Then I pulled out the thick folder of evidence and slid it across the table toward her. I showed her Derek's bankruptcy filing, the fraud investigation, the $68,000 debt hanging around his neck like an anchor. Cassandra shook her head immediately. "That's all in the past," she whispered. Derek changed, but then I turned to the final page. The mortgage application filed under my name. The forged signature. I looked straight into my daughter's eyes. "Do you even know what your husband was planning to do to this house?" I asked quietly. Silence. Her lips began to tremble, and in that moment she finally understood something terrible. The house was never meant to be their future home. It was meant to be the sacrifice Derek used to escape his debts. "Do you think Cassandra is truly innocent? Tell me what you think before we reach the final courtroom showdown." Then I showed her a photograph of Ruth Ann Pellier. I told her about the $12,000 meant for medication and retirement that ended up inside Derek's pocket. That was when Cassandra finally broke. Her crying sounded dry and sharp like wood splitting inside a fire. I told her something my father once told me. Wood never lies. And neither do numbers. Derek had built their entire marriage on a rotten foundation. I took my daughter's trembling hands in mine. "A broken structure has to be torn apart completely before it can be rebuilt," I said softly. Then I gave her a choice. She could sink alongside Derek on his drowning ship, or she could help me drive the final nails into the case that would destroy him forever. Cassandra looked down at the folder, then back at me. Inside her eyes was a brutal war between blind love and unavoidable truth, and I knew this was the load-bearing point of everything. If she refused me, I would fight alone. But if she chose to stand beside me, we would become an unbreakable joint inside that courtroom. Finally, Cassandra picked up the folder and rose slowly to her feet. She never said yes, but the way she clutched those papers told me all I needed to know. The grain inside her had finally started to turn. Our conversation ended there. But the real storm was only beginning. Because the moment we walked into that courtroom, everything Derek had built was about to collapse. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Each tick sounded like a hammer striking a chisel. Judge Castor sat high above us, with a face as cold and sharp as a steel plane blade. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands resting flat against the cheap manufactured wood surface. For a moment I found myself missing the smooth grain of the walnut furniture back home. Across from me sat Derek. His suit hung too loose around shoulders that had shrunk under the weight of fear. Gone was the arrogant man who twisted my wrist in my own kitchen. His lawyer opened with arguments about residential rights and implied ownership. He claimed Derek had earned the right to stay because the house was part of the family. It was a weak attempt to bend reality, like a bad carpenter smearing glue across a crack, instead of repairing the structure properly. But I had built stronger joints than that. I rose slowly and presented evidence of unauthorized structural changes Derek had made inside the house. I submitted repair bills tied to the fake loan schemes he was creating. Most important of all, I presented proof that Derek had never paid a single dollar toward rent maintenance or household expenses. A house cannot stand on a foundation built from lies. I watched Judge Castor's expression shift gradually from curiosity to open disgust as he looked toward Derek. His lawyer tried to fight back, but every argument collapsed beneath the weight of the financial records spread across the courtroom table. I looked at Derek carefully, and strangely I felt no satisfaction, only sadness. He was rotten wood inside my family's structure, a decayed beam that had to be removed before the rest of the house could heal. Then came the sound of the judge's gavel. Sharp, final, an eviction order within 35 days. Derek froze in his chair. The hatred in his eyes burned toward me, but it no longer mattered. I turned toward Cassandra sitting in the gallery. She gave me a small nod. One broken joint had finally been repaired. One piece of justice had been restored. Before we reach the final blow that leaves Derek with no escape, make sure to like and subscribe to support Harlan's journey. I walked out of the courthouse into the warm afternoon, sunlight falling across the stone steps, but I knew this was only the first victory. The eviction order reclaimed the shell of the house. Nothing more. If I wanted to truly destroy Derek's empire of lies, I needed something stronger than civil court. I needed criminal charges. Inside my bag were the statements from Thomas Whitfield and Ruth Ann Pellier. Those testimonies were the final nails. And I wasn't going to stop until Derek paid for every piece of wood he had splintered along the way. The courtroom battle was over, but the real hunt was just beginning. And my next stop was the State Attorney General's office. I walked into the State Attorney General's office, carrying a bag heavy with files. This was no longer a dispute over a house. This was the dismantling of a large-scale fraud network. I set the stack of documents down on the investigator's desk and presented each case one by one: Thomas Whitfield, Ruth Ann Pellier, and the other forgotten victims I had spent weeks tracking down. I told them I've already built the structure and put every piece in place. The rest belongs to the law. The investigator carefully examined the evidence of forged signatures, fraudulent loans, and federal financial crimes. His eyes grew sharper with every page he turned. Numbers never lie. And the rotten timber Derek had tried so hard to hide was finally exposed beneath the light of justice. Together, the victims had become something powerful. We were no longer isolated people who had been manipulated one at a time. We had become a unified structure, a massive load-bearing force ready to collapse directly onto the con artist who built his life on lies. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. The same feeling a carpenter gets when the final nail finally slides into place inside a difficult framework. Everything had aligned exactly the way it was supposed to. A few days later, I watched my old house from across the street. Police cars filled the driveway. Then Derek was escorted outside in handcuffs. The man who once twisted my wrist in my own kitchen couldn't even lift his head now. His arrogance had disappeared completely. Neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk, whispering as officers led him toward the patrol car. Then I saw Cassandra, standing on the porch. She watched her husband being taken away with a completely empty expression. That was the price of building your future on a rotten foundation. I took a slow breath. And, for the first time in a long while, I could smell pine in the air again. The destroyer had been removed. My family's structure still carried scars, but the termites were gone. Soon Derek would face cold prison walls instead of leather chairs and expensive whiskey. No walnut furniture, no false luxury, only steel bars, concrete floors, and the weight of regret arriving far too late. Before we reach the emotional ending and the restoration of Harlan's home, tell me in the comments how you feel about this final blow against Derek. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't need to watch the rest of his collapse. I had something more important to do. I needed to go home. My house was waiting for its real owner. I would rehang the cabinet doors. I would repaint the walls. I would heal every damaged piece of wood with these scarred hands. Justice had been delivered with precision. Now it was time for restoration. I pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The house welcomed me with silence. Derek was gone. All he left behind was a battlefield of chaos and wounds carved into wood and walls. I set my toolbox down on the floor. The sound of metal striking hardwood echoed through the house like a declaration of ownership. I started working immediately. I removed the cabinet doors. Derek had torn off alignment. I carefully planed away the deep scratches he left on my 30-year-old walnut cutting board. Thin layers of wood curled onto the floor like old pain finally being shaved away. Then I repainted the charcoal walls Derek once mocked as outdated. Fresh paint covered the stains of betrayal smoothly. Because justice is not a single moment. It is a structure you build carefully so it remains standing long after the noise ends. Then Cassandra appeared quietly in the hallway. She was carrying a small can of paint. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up a brush and started painting beside me. And somehow the silence between us felt different now. Not heavy. Healing. Wood needs time to dry after glue is applied. Relationships are no different. Cassandra had filed for divorce. She finally chose to cut the tumor named Derek out of her life completely. We worked together through the entire night. Slowly, the house began to look like itself again. The joints tightened, the cracks were filled, and I could almost feel life returning to the grain of every board inside that home. This wasn't just repair work. It was the restoration of a family's honor. The next morning I stood on the front porch holding a hot cup of coffee. Light snow drifted across the winter garden, covering everything in white silence. I looked down at my hands. fresh scars layered over old calluses. But I felt no pain, only pride. I had protected my foundation from the worst storm of deception I had ever faced. Thank you for joining Dad's Real Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you never miss another hard-earned lesson. I'll see you in the next story. I took another sip of coffee and felt warmth spread slowly through my chest. The house finally felt strong again. No more groaning beneath the footsteps of strangers. It stood quiet, proud, at peace. I looked over at Cassandra sleeping in the cleaned leather armchair. And I knew one thing for certain. No con artist would ever cross this threshold again. Because I was the carpenter guarding the joints of my family. And sometimes a new life begins when old wood is finally restored.